Online, yeah. I want to welcome everyone here today. Thank you for coming, and thanks to all the folks who are online. We have some great questions that came your way. That came our way ahead of the event. I'm going to ask some of them directly, and they also will influence what I will act here. I'm E.J. Dion. I'm a senior fellow here at Brookings, and this is one in a series of events we're having on the early part on the Trump administration. We've done an event on the first 100 days. We're at 300 days, and we're going to have other events. Today's event, just so you know, focuses very specifically on the other branches of government and how they have interacted with President Trump, how they have performed, what we can learn from these early months. Brookings also has put together a whole series of trackers of various numbers that you want to keep a look at. Let me just ask the panel so I don't forget. Tell us about the trackers. I'll start with Molly, who knows of several that are either out there or planned. Go ahead, Molly.
Yeah, so there's in an attempt to sort of provide a comprehensive view of a range of things. Katie has won nominations that she'll talk about, and Scott on the team at Lawfare have won on litigation, and then our colleague Rachel Pereira has one that's focused on litigation related to the Department of Education specifically.
So you can keep track with us,
Right.
And you should take a look at our website. I'll introduce the panel, and I'll start with an elephant in the room question, if I may. Sarah Binder is Senior Fellow at Governance Studies and also part of the Center for Effective Public Management. She is also a distinguished professor at George Washington University. Molly Reynolds is the Vice President and Director of the Governance Studies program, for which I am very grateful. Molly was just formally named Vice President, and there was great celebration in our department. And she is a real Brookings veteran, going back. She was, some people in the audience know the work of Tom Mann, and her first job at Brookings was being a research assistant for Tom Mann. So she is in a wonderful lineage, and we're grateful that she is our Vice President. Katie Dunn-Tempest is the director of the Initiative for Improving Interbranch Relations and is a visiting fellow in governance studies. She is head of a project named after Bob Katzman, our brilliant colleague who was an appeals court judge in the Second Circuit, if I remember right, and a wonderful, wonderful person. He had Molly's job once upon a time as well. But Katie, it's great to have you here. And Scott Anderson is a fellow in the Governance Studies program also. He is, I love the title of this, you can explain it later, the Section 230 Project. It sounds like the title of a thriller, like a Ludlum thriller. And here at the Brookings Institution, and he's general counsel and senior editor at Lawfare. So let me start with our congressional experts, Molly and Sarah. Rather big events happened yesterday in the Congress, and really for the first time on something substantive, correct me if I'm wrong, this Republican Congress really ended up defying the president in a way that a couple of months ago people were not, I think, widely predicting. 3 Republicans joining with Democrats on that discharge petition forced a vote on the releasing the Epstein files, and it became pretty clear that this was going to go through both houses. And President Trump, who had been resisting and resisting, and his Justice Department had been resisting and resisting doing this, decided that he was for this all along, sort of, but at least decided he was going to, said he would sign it. What do we learn about this? What do we learn from this? Is this the beginning of a period where we might see more independence from Republicans in Congress from the president? And also, what do we learn? I'll have a follow-up on this. Maybe I'll kick it to Sarah. What do we learn about relationships between the House and the Senate? But I'll elaborate on that question after. But Molly.
Yeah, so I think it's certainly a notable event. If for no other reason than, and Sarah has some really excellent data that she's been tracking for a long time on the success of discharge petitions. And spoiler alert, they are rarely successful. We rarely see a group of members of the House successfully go around their House leadership to get something on the agenda that the Speaker of the House does not want there. So that is notable. I am somewhat skeptical that this is a major pivot or a real change in direction for congressional Republicans and their relationship to President Trump. I think there are sort of important things about the politics of this issue specifically, which is to say that my sense is that there were a sizable number of Republican members, especially in the House, who felt like this issue had sort of risen to sufficient prominence, particularly in kind of the right-wing media ecosystem. They were hearing about it from constituents, that they were getting pressure to vote a certain way, even if that wasn't what President Trump wanted. And at the end of the day, that was kind of breaking in favor of voting to release. And so I tend to see this as not a real turning point. Maybe I will be proven wrong. Maybe we will see this as the start of a group of Republicans really standing up to the Trump administration. But on lots and lots of other questions that are more strongly about actual congressional power, we have not really yet seen Republicans choose to push back in a systematic, very public way in the way that they did on this vote.
Let me just ask a quick follow-up on that. This event happened after number one, sort of midterm elections, off-year elections that went badly for the Republicans almost everywhere. Trump's approval is way down. There was a poll this morning that showed Republicans 14 points behind Democrats in the race for the House next year. Does this interact with that in any way to create, and you can see particular difficulties they're having around reaching agreement even among themselves on the healthcare issue? Yeah,
I mean, I think one important dynamic around this discharge petition and the Epstein files is that it's really it's a public issue in a way that some of the questions about, again, congressional power and the power of the purse are not publicly salient in the same way.
Yeah.
So I expect that Republican members are not getting lots of phone calls from angry constituents saying, why aren't you exercising the power of the purse? I suspect they're getting more phone calls about things like the Epstein files because those are the things that are getting media attention, and that's filtering down into any constituent pressure.
Although healthcare may be an issue on which they are getting.
Yes, I think that's fair, and we'll see kind of what direction that goes in between now and December.
So Sarah, reaching for all your expertise on discharge petitions, filibuster, and those sorts of things, what did you make of this? And I was struck also by, at the end of yesterday, what seemed like charitably a failure of communication between the House Speaker and the Republican Majority Leader of the Senate, where Speaker Johnson suggested to members, don't worry, the Senate will fix this. And then Senator Thune basically decided, no, he's not going to fix this. He's not going to object when Chuck Schumer proposed a unanimous consent to just pass the bill, and there were no objections. I'm curious what this says going forward, because it was, I think, a particularly difficult moment to, again, I think charitably for Speaker Johnson. Could you talk about your general view of this?
Sure. First, the discharge petition, and then the question on the House-Senate kerfuffle yesterday. The only thing I'd add to Molly are two things. And the first speaks towards probably the limited precedent here, like that we shouldn't see a lot of more successful discharge petitions likely. But the one somewhat unique thing about the issue, to conjure up my favorite political scientist, with all due respect, those around, E. Schatznyder of long blessed memory, who wrote in the 1960s about socializing conflict, right? To get the audience off the sidelines. If you're losing a battle, what do? like you break it open. You get the audience off the sidelines and into the game. And that video, the ad of the survivors, is just like quintessential, how do you engage people to get not the discussion of discharge and files and DOJ, but the bigger, broader issue. And when I mentioned that in class today, I had just seen like a clip on the internet, and a student in the back of the classroom says, yes, it was played on Monday Night Football as an ad. It's like, oh, well, now they know I don't actually watch Monday Night Football. But anyways, right?
I do.
Like, there it was, right? A different audience that, well, let's not go with the audience of Monday Night Football, but you could imagine that it's like broadening the scope of conflict here. So that might make this, as Molly said, sort of a more unique, maybe like a perfect storm here of propelling it. The only thing working the other way is just to keep in mind like why that discharge petition exists in the first place. Like why would you have a mechanism here for a majority to counteract the power of the speaker, who these days largely can pretty much set the agenda. We go all the way back to 1910 and the revolt against an overbearing, overreaching Speaker Cannon, right? And both the minority party and a faction of the majority kind of repelled against him for a number of reasons, not least his kind of turning the thumbscrews on the agenda. And so that pressure valve, it's there, right? But Johnson, because Trump told him, don't let this come out anywhere, he didn't let that pressure valve out, and no surprise then, you get to 218 and you get these other dynamics Molly talked about. So if that's the case, it's possible you have other issues coming to the floor like this. It's just they probably don't have the immediate political salience and like the Trump particular issue there. So generally speaking, I think that's, we want to keep in mind like why you get these discharge motions in the first place. On this question about the House versus Senate, so as best I understand, so after either right before the vote or after the vote, Speaker Johnson showed up and he had in his press conference, always with the billboard there, a list of things they wanted changes, and including more protections for the survivors. When it went over to the Senate, it seems that Thune never committed to Johnson to make the changes. And it sounded like from what Thune or his staff said today or yesterday afternoon, they had the Senate council go through and kind of do a more methodical, they've had plenty of time to look at the bill, and concluded that there were protections in there, and that in that case, why put the Senate's hands on this, right? One never knows when this president might change his mind about the House and Senate Republicans pushing this through. So I think that's, in the end, what happened. Johnson may or may not have realized that, I don't know. But, the House and Senate, they're not like big buddies, right? And turning on the other chambers, part of the game, as it were. So I'm not so surprised that the Senate said, look, you can play that politics, but we're done here. And then Chuck Schumer, took it and ran with it.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing up Schatzschneider, a great political scientist. We can't know what those no longer with us would think, but I think he would not mind being used in this context somehow, if I read him right from back then. We don't think a lot, because there's so much else going on, we don't think a lot about the issues that Katie has done a lot of work on, and they are really important because who staffs the government really, really matters. And Katie has done a lot of work on nominations. So let me ask you about the pace of nominations. You've got data going back to George W. Bush on that. John Thune, again, going nuclear by having this process of passing a whole bunch of nominees en bloc. Talk about where they are, why that happened, and what you make of nominations up to this point.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you. So in contrast to Sarah and Molly, I study presidential personnel, and I'm really curious and interested in the types of people that presidents appoint in this first 300-day period. This project actually started during the Biden administration, during the campaign, when he was making promises to create a government that looked like America. And so some of my Brookings colleagues said, we should really track this and see if, in fact, the nominations he makes and the people who get confirmed to serve in the executive branch do reflect the composition of the American populace. And we just decided at the time when Trump became president that we would continue this. So I examined not only the pace of nominations, which is very important because In the executive branch, there are roughly 700 confirmed positions across the 15 major departments that need to be confirmed, and they're at the highest echelon of leadership across our government. But the pace of confirmations ever since Ronald Reagan has grown increasingly slow with each administration. So this notion that you could even fill 700 positions is out of the question when the pace the first year for Biden, it was only 140 people that got confirmed in that first 300 days. So I'm very concerned about the pace of nominations. If presidents win the election, they're entitled to staff the executive branch. But if the Senate isn't able to confirm these individuals, in effect, it's a power without really being a power. And not only that, our government is run by sort of proxies or actings or intermediary types of people. So if you're somebody who cares about leadership, then you should also be concerned about the pace of confirmations. And the other aspect of the original project was to look at the gender breakdown, the race breakdown, and ethnicity. And again, it was all to sort of see if Biden was keeping true to his promise. We've kept the tracker going, and what it shows after 300 days in the Trump administration is that his pace was actually faster than President Biden and his first administration, but not as fast as President Obama or President Bush. That may very well be a bygone era, that we will never get back to the pace of confirmations at that point. In terms of gender breakdown, he has the fewest women in this data set going back to George W. Bush in 2001. There are 84% men serving in these roughly 218 confirmed slots. 84% male, 91%.
Is this Trump you're talking about?
Currently,
Yeah.
right. 84% male, 91% white. So when it comes to race and ethnicity, he is off the charts. He has surpassed the breakdown that he had in his first administration in 2017. So it is the least diverse set, first tranche of nominees, but the pace is somewhat faster. And this, talking about the pace, gets to what EJ intimated, which is that in September, John Thune went nuclear, invoked the nuclear option to create a new way to vote on nominees, and it's called en bloc. And so for anybody that's not a cabinet official, you can vote for a large tranche of nominees. So there was a vote in September with 40-some nominees that were voted all at once. So instead of considering the nominations singularly, which they had to do before, this new en bloc rule enabled for a quicker final vote on the floor. There was another tranche of nominees in October. 115 out of the 118 nominees that Trump had in that last 200 to 300 day period were all done en bloc. So only 3 were voted on individually. So you can see that this new en bloc rule, that going nuclear, actually did facilitate confirmations within the Senate. The problem is that it only affects the last stage of the process, which is the final vote. So it's not at all clear going forward that the committee stage of the nomination process and all of the vetting that they do will actually go faster. So the final vote is faster, but that's not at all clear that it will sort of be this panacea to make confirmations go more quickly. And I'll leave it at that. And if you have other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful. Scott, I told you before we came in, I looked up some numbers this morning, and we want to talk about the courts. And the popular narrative is that the Supreme Court has so far served given Trump a blank check. That is kind of my view, I should say, out front. And you have a slightly, but somewhat more complicated view. But I wanted to read you these numbers that Trump's win rate in district courts, based on this, is according to a group called Court Accountability. This is their collection of numbers. Trump's win rate in the district courts is 40%. His win rate in the circuit courts is 41%, 90 orders. His win rate in the Supreme Court is 90% based on 23 orders, most of them on the emergency docket, a lot of them 6-3. So I'll ask you, that's a pretty big number, which feeds the narrative that I broadly share. You can respond to those numbers, and you can complicate the story if you want.
Sure. I think when you look at high-level numbers like this, it can be very deceiving because you're comparing, to some extent, apples and oranges. The Supreme Court is unique in terms of its jurisdiction, the matters it hears. Somebody has to ask to raise a matter to the Supreme Court before it can exercise jurisdiction. Then it has to grant that. It has a fair amount of discretionary jurisdiction, a few small exceptions that haven't really come up in the current term that I can think of, saying it has to volunteer to take up the matter. So when you see the number of cases that involving the government that the Supreme Court has ruled on, particularly over the less than a year the Trump administration has been in the White House, just bear in mind, these are the cases that one party, usually the government, has chosen to elevate to the Supreme Court, to seek to bring to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has voluntarily taken up. Different from the district courts or the appellate courts, where you generally have plaintiffs defining, here's the scope of the matters we have to consider. It's much more of a mandatory process, and that you have a whole universe of issues that get raised there. Now, the Trump administration is only going to go to the Supreme Court with matters where it thinks it might win. There's a whole universe of legal issues that the Trump administration has not taken to the Supreme Court. Perhaps it's a bandwidth issue, perhaps they think they'll win, perhaps they don't see an urgency to vindicating their views, even if they are losing at the district court, and there are cases in all of these categories. But if they take a matter to the Supreme Court, they're making a strategic decision to do that. Sometimes, and often they do win, as these statistics indicate, although I want to muddy that for a second as well. There are also high-profile cases where they don't, or where it's not clear they're going to win. The tariff cases, the domestic deployment cases currently pending, we're aware of Alien Enemies Act cases, and related cases where the Supreme Court has actually pushed back substantially what the administration wanted to do. So it's not a super clean picture. The one thing that is clear for this Supreme Court is that they are much, much more inclined to follow the government's lead when it asks them to weigh in on a matter. That's why the emergency docket or the shadow docket, as some call it, become much more important. Because many of these cases, many of the high-profile cases the court has entertained, came through this process where even though normally you would expect them to go through more intermediate review or appellate courts, or they relate to preliminary relief that usually isn't subject to the degree of appellate scrutiny until you get to a final judgment, the government has come and said, no, Supreme Court, we want you to weigh in on this now, prematurely, earlier than you normally would, because we think it's very important. Supreme Court takes those requests very seriously. That is not entirely new, but there is a confluence of both the executive branch doing this much more often under this administration and Supreme Court taking them very seriously. That probably a degree that's more so than prior courts would have. Although notably, I think the Supreme Court generally takes the executive branch quite seriously when it asks for its intervention. We know that from things like calls for the views of the Solicitor Generals, where the government's position on that generally takes the cake. That responds to those specific numbers. Do you want me to get into a little bit of the substance of the cases?
Yeah, and this Supreme Court over the years has vastly increased the use of the emergency docket. No, or are you saying this is an interaction between the court itself and this particular executive branch?
It's very clearly an interaction between the executive branch and Supreme Court, because most of these shadow docket cases are being brought up under this administration by the government. That was less true during prior terms. During the Biden administration, we saw a number of other shadow docket cases where you saw other plaintiffs trying to bring things more urgently to the court, and the court was responsive to that, but not at the scale we're seeing today. This scale really is a confluence of the executive branch asking more and the Supreme Court being more open to it. And we know that, if you want a really clear example of that, look at the tariffs case, because we had not one, but two requests to go to the Supreme Court prematurely, quote unquote, or to take up the matter. One from private plaintiffs and learning resources. This is one of the two matters currently before the Supreme Court that came through DC District Federal Court. There, the plaintiffs got a judgment in their favor to the district court and then petitioned straight to the Supreme Court and said, Supreme Court, you know you're going to have to resolve this. It's really expensive while we have these outstanding questions. Why don't you just take this matter up straight from the district court instead of waiting for the DC Circuit to weigh in, and then we can have quicker resolution of all of this. The Supreme Court didn't bite. They waited. And they waited. And meanwhile, litigation was happening in two other courts, the Court of International Trade and the Federal Appellate Court overseeing that. And there, the Federal Circuit. There you saw two judgments again, or two decisions come out against the administration. And the administration finally said, well, Supreme Court, we really think you need to take it up. And by the way, we need to take it up on an expedited timeline, because now that we've lost twice, we need to get pretty quick resolution of this. And what did the Supreme Court do? Then it took it up. And actually granted the learning resources request earlier, but not until the government filed the parallel request. So we wanted to show the example of the equities the court views differently. It views it really differently when the government asks to expedite consideration of things. And that is a big part of the reason we're seeing this pattern in the use of the emergency docket, in my view.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I have a sense that there is much more grumbling at the district court level about the Supreme Court. There was a remarkable piece the New York Times did where it contacted a group of district court judges where they feel they're being kind of left out to dry. The Supreme Court is making certain rulings on the shadow docket without opinions that seem ready to reverse certain precedents, but these aren't real guidance to the lower courts. Is this are we facing an unusual kind of interaction between the district courts and the Supreme Courts in this period?
We are, in part because of this heightened use of the emergency docket. And it really relates also to the resolution on the merits and the absence thereof of a lot of these issues that are coming to the Supreme Court. Really, of the issues that come to the Supreme Court over the course of the Trump administration, I would say only one bucket is clearly the Supreme Court's weighing in on the merits, and in truth is they haven't actually fully done it yet. That tends to be appointment clause questions. These are questions about saying, okay, does the president have the authority to appoint someone despite certain statutory restrictions Congress has imposed? Are those restrictions unconstitutional because the president has broad appointment under the Appointments Clause, broad authority under the Appointments Clause? This has been a bit of a hobby horse for the conservative legal movement for many decades. It is not a Trump unique thing. This is something that people like John Roberts, Amy Coney Barrett, and Clarence Thomas, although not so much what is confirmed, kind of were confirmed with knowledge of and with a view of and have expressed views of academically through lower court opinions, right? It's not entirely surprising to see this court lean that way, although it's very much new law, right? They're reversing prior precedents, are likely to reverse Humphrey's executor and other long-standing precedents defining the scope of authority in this area. Most of the other judgments, determinations we've seen, including most of the ones on the Trump administration's behalf, are actually much more intermediary judgments, not a final resolution. Often they relate to a procedural measure, a jurisdictional question. So for example, a number of matters relating to legal challenges to the termination of federal employees or the challenges to cancellations of funding. There's a question about saying, well, can these determinations, do they have to go through established statutory procedures like Merit Service Protection Boards for employees, or under the Tucker Act, do they have to go to particular procedures to challenge federal funding decisions? And in cases, lower courts in a number of these cases, and in the funding case in particular, the Supreme Court, eventually weighed in and said, okay, well, it's a complicated picture, but generally they've sided with the government and said, yeah, they have to go through these special procedures. That's not a determination as to whether anyone's right or wrong. It's not even a determination on the merits yet. That's going to come at a later phase under those other courts now under these rulings. It comes up as one of these stats saying the Trump administration has won, but it doesn't ultimately vindicate what the Trump administration has done. It's saying it has to go through this separate channel. So it is a win on procedural or jurisdictional grounds, but not on these other grounds. A number of other cases, it's about preliminary relief. The real question is, okay, who gets an injunction while we're figuring out what the ultimate resolution of this legal issue is? Lower courts have been much more generous to plaintiffs on that ground than the Supreme Court has. I suspect this goes back, in part, and I should say, this might be different views on the merits. The Supreme Court, I suspect, is more conservative, more friendly to the administration's arguments than district courts are, just based on partisan composition, ideological composition alone. Part of it also, however, is that the overall formula for whether determining who gets preliminary relief isn't just who do we think is right on the merits. It also says, well, who do we think is more affected by this? What are the broader equities? Is it the government or the private plaintiff? And the Supreme Court, I think, is very, very friendly to the argument that the government is affected by things, particularly where it interferes with their perceived policy judgment.
Particularly the executive.
No, I mean the
say
executive.
government.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean the executive specifically. So in a lot of these cases, they have said, without issuing much substantive guidance, okay, in this sort of category of cases, we think the government gets preliminary relief. I mean, it can proceed, or usually that means the plaintiffs don't get preliminary relief. The government can do what it's doing right now, but the legal challenge is still going on in the background, and that may mean that the plaintiffs are entitled to greater damages or other remedies on the back end. But in the interim, the government gets to do what it wants to do. That is a real world consequence. I don't want to minimize that, but it's not the same as reaching an ultimate resolution that vindicates the Trump administration's actions on the macro legal level. Most of those decisions, again, are going to come at a later stage. Some may go the government's way, many probably will, but not necessarily all of them will. And again, we want to look at examples of that in practice. Look again at the tariffs case right now. There is a preliminary injunction for the government on the tariffs case. Actually, lower courts granted that too. But if you watch the Supreme Court argument, the court's very skeptical of the government's views, at least in regards to the most aggressive use of the tariff authority. And I think you may see a similar pattern in other cases.
Thank you. Speaking of division of powers, the power of the purse, is it an antique concept like the word purse? We started the administration, DOGE was the sort of lead-in here, and all kinds of cuts being made that were not made by Congress. You have new news about dismantling the education department, which last I checked, the Congress hasn't dismantled itself. Talk about the power of the purse, what it means now, what we've learned again in these 100 days.
Yeah, I'll actually start with this question by picking up on something Scott was talking about, which is one thing that we have seen in this administration is a real effort, one by the executive branch, to intrude in Congress's constitutional and statutory authority to control the flow of federal funds. And then efforts to use the courts as a backstop to congressional power in this space. And we've learned that the courts are really ill-equipped to do that for a couple of different reasons. And one gets to this sort of timing question that Scott is talking about. So this notion that if you are a contractor or a grantee or a federal employee or anyone who is affected by the consequences of a Trump administration decision to not spend money that Congress has appropriated or attempt to impose additional conditions on funding that Congress has appropriated, or any number of things. And you want to turn to the courts as your avenue for trying to fix that problem. The speed at which these things proceed is incompatible with kind of you actually getting the money on the schedule that you expected to do so. It's also the case that there are long-standing doctrines and approaches that courts use to weigh in on appropriations law cases that really don't, I think, match the scope of what we are seeing this administration try to do in terms of its spending power. And so the last thing I'll say, and then eager to hear Sarah's thoughts on this as well, is that when the consequences of the executive branch intruding into Congress's power aren't just sort of immediate consequences for particular streams of funding in this moment. They're also fundamentally reshaping the way that Congress has to negotiate deals among themselves on spending questions. And this is one of the things that was at the heart of the 40-plus day shutdown that we just came out of. This question of, if you are Congress and you are going to do the hard work of negotiating a deal on how much money to spend for X, Y, or Z, it is substantially harder to do that if you don't believe that the executive branch is going to commit to fulfilling the deal that you have reached on the back end. And so I think that is making it that much harder for Congress to do what is already hard work in the spending context.
In a way, it says, why make any deal at all if you have no idea if the executive is going to upend it?
Sort of taken to its logical conclusion, that is one place that we could end up. And I'll just say one more thing, now that you come back to me, which is that one way that we have tended to see individual Republican members of Congress to respond to this set of circumstances is to use their own kind of power as Republicans to go directly to the White House and seek solutions to their individual challenges. So one example of this over the summer, when the White House had proposed for cancellation, and I will say that they did this in kind of the way that is prescribed under the Budget Act, the way that is available to them legally, which is to say, we would like to cancel these funds. We're going to send, we call it a special message, it's a delightful term, send a special message to Congress, and Congress will take up our proposal to cancel a defined set of funds. This was how they canceled funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. But there was a Republican senator who was concerned about the consequences of canceling funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting for tribal radio stations. And the sort of solution to that was to go directly to the White House and say, hey, I have this specific concern about this proposal that you have made. Can we reach a deal outside of the confines of this legislation to address my problem? And when he got his problem addressed, then he was willing to vote for it. And so when you have individual Republicans who are able to address their concerns kind of outside of the legislative process, it reduces the incentive for them to try and get together collectively, either themselves or working with Democrats, to push back as an institution against what we are seeing the executive branch do.
Which increases executive power.
Exactly.
And you saw that on some of the grants to universities where I think down in Alabama, there was a desire to keep money flowing to University of Alabama at Birmingham, for example. And yeah, that's interesting. Sarah, just your views on this, but I'd love you to talk about a couple of things. One is the filibuster. Senator Thune, your area of expertise, President Trump keeps telling him, get rid of the filibuster. He has resisted. Where does that stand? And do you think there is any chance that the filibuster would fall between now and the 2026 election? And since I want to get to the audience, I'll combine a couple questions I know you're interested in. The other is when there's unified party control, there is often overreach. Overreach often creates a backlash. Where do you see that standing when you look forward, without predicting with exact numbers how the 2026 election is going to turn out? How do you see that? And sort of overreach and the filibuster are kind of in tension with each other.
Yeah, I'll take a roundabout way to the overreach and then squarely on the overreach. Just to pick up on where Molly left off, like the question I always asked in 2017 was always being questioned here at Brookings was, like, whenever Trump did something, the question was, can he do that, right? And the question was always, well, you'd open up the rule book, you'd open up the Constitution, you'd look at laws, and you'd like trying to find some sort of legal basis for what he was doing. But that's not the question anymore, right? The question is always like, can he be stopped, right? And that's not a matter of institutions, right? That's a matter of norms, right? And as Molly said, look, the courts haven't proven a speedy way to solve some of these problems. Why? Well, in part because these problems in the past, to lesser, not quite the Trumpian degree, but they're worked out, right? Interbranch accommodation, they find ways. Defense Department wants to move a little money this way, they get sign off from the Defense Armed Services Committee, right? Things get worked out because of the underlying norms. And that's the problem here, which also helps lead to overreach, is that at least two norms, they're definitely frayed. Like, certainly the biggest one, the rule of law, where you kind of abide by the spirit of law, if not the letter of the law, that's not in great shape. But also in the kind of accommodation world, right? Norm of forbearance. You have all these procedural rights or legal rights or constitutional rights, but you don't always exercise them, and you don't always push it right beyond the end, that's the overreach here. And I think if we wanted to like spin a story here of overreach, I think that's sort of what we're looking at, right? Certainly overreach on Epstein and trying to block the papers. Overreach, I think, just judging from the type of public opinion polls that EJ you mentioned earlier, even immigration, his views are down. Why? Well, they start to plummet when we see video of National Guard being mobilized in LA, right? Not very targeted, quite violent, right? That's overreach, definitely overreach. Think about the shutdown. Russ Vought says, ooh, this is a great opportunity. We're going to do more firing, even though technically legally they're not supposed to be doing RIFs during shutdowns. And the overreach on SNAP, right? First saying SNAP will continue because Congress has appropriated money for it, and then changing their mind halfway through, no, we're going to cut off SNAP. That's overreach. And we know that majorities do it. Why? Not just Republicans, but Democrats, to lesser or more degrees. Think about it. We have unified party control, as you said, but we also know it doesn't last very long, right? We have very slim majorities. We have tight electoral competition, right? Slim majorities, House and Senate. Now we have a popularly elected president who wins a majority of the Electoral College, but we've had some, what you might think of as minority presidents.
Yep.
in various, however one wants to define it, right? So, and that gives rise to overreach. Why? Because you're not, deep down, you're not going to keep control. And on average, we've got unified party control over the post-war period, or post-1990s when Democrats start to lose, 2 years at best. You're going to lose one chamber, especially the House. So you overreach because that's your limited time. You stuff a lot of stuff into reconciliation bills. You overreach on what the administration can do. And I think that comes back to bite the administration. I think if you look at Republican public opinion polls, still pretty strong support for him. But that's, even if you add in independents, who are in some polls 2/3 of them favoring Democrats in the coming election, the elections you pointed to, like writings on the wall, we're back in a world of normal electoral politics, which is, American public's not firmly on one side or the other, even if they're narrowly divided at any one time.
Yeah, and EJ, can I add something here, which is just a greater context, which is that you also have to remember what happened between 2017 and 2021. So the overreach, it was pent-up demand for overreach. They also had the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. They had the American First Policy Institute, who was steadily working over the course of the 4 years of the Biden administration to come up with new programs. They were not going to waste a second. And you can actually see it in the nominations because they came out like just a cannon in terms of the number of nominations, the zealousness with which they pursued a variety of programs. But it's starting to wane. So this last 300 days of nominations, according to my colleague Chris Piper, is actually the lowest going all the way back to Reagan. It's like they're losing steam. But when they came in, it was Operation Overreach, right? There was like pent-up demand to do all of the things that Sarah was. So if there was norm breaking and norm bending in the first term, it was going to be branch breaking in the second term.
And on that point, and then a quick question to Scott, and then I want to open so everybody can be brief because I want to let folks in. And just, I'm going to take a number of questions together so we can get as many voices in as we can. How do you compare the nature of the Trump nominees in Trump 2 to Trump 1? Mm-hmm. This Trump 2 set seems much more committed to the Trump agenda, with less formal background historically in some of the areas where they're serving, the head of the FBI comes to mind as an example. How do you compare the two Trump terms? Because I think there are some pretty dramatic differences.
Yeah, there's huge differences. And the first time they were willing to sort of not take chances, but they were willing to go for mainstream Republicans who had worked for President Bush and hire them. We saw the incredible amount of staff turnover at the highest levels during that first year. It was off the charts. And so I think Project 2025, the people at American First Policy Institute went back to their desks and said, we have to do something different. So they had sort of quote unquote loyalty tests, but there was like a battery of questions asking you about who you voted for in the past and your sort of allegiance to the candidate Trump, then President Trump. So they were much more systematic about their vetting of people for these most senior jobs and did not take chances. Right? And so they started the administration with this sort of database of people who had sort of passed this litmus test. And they did not do that the first time around. So far, we're seeing less turnover than we saw in the first year in 2017. And in some respects, it's paying it off. But if you also look at it from the other side of the equation, which is, are these people qualified? That raises a lot of questions. Like I just did a sort of a shorthand study of looking at the 15 major department cabinet secretaries and their backgrounds going all the way back to Reagan, their backgrounds before they became attorney general or before they became head of the FBI. And there were stark comparisons in terms of sort of the qualifications, the kind of blue ribbon resume materials about education and prior jobs. That's a stark difference as well. But it seems to be working for Trump at this point, so we'll see what happens.
So it's essentially Trump 2 versus everything that came before, including Trump 1. That's the contrast.
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Scott, I want to combine two questions we talked about, which is the impact on the institutional structure of government under Trump, and what are the prospects of reversing some of these? As we talked about going in, if you have this vast expansion of executive authority, a new Democratic president might well say, well, they used it, I don't want to give that back. I wouldn't have done this myself, but why should I give back this power? Talk about how you see the effect on the way government operates and what might happen after. What would be the legacy of this?
Yeah, it's a very real effect. the biggest impact we're seeing on the separation of powers, which is a substantial effective aggrandizement of executive authority, really is, in my view, predominantly a product of the breakdown of norms that Sarah mentioned.
Yeah.
A lot of the norms that have usually restricted and constrained interbranch relations from getting too far beyond to a high point of conflict, those have really broken down quite deliberately. They've been pretty much ignored by the administration on a lot of different fronts and aggressively pushed, combined with some real legal moves, particularly in the Appointments Clause context, and a lot of these breakdown of the procedural and legal backstops that we've seen in the law. Now, those may still be there, but again, the alacrity, the speed with which they're manifesting is very slow, and there is some legal ambiguity as to whether, again, do these requests have to go to the Tucker Act or not? How available will the courts be for a remedy? And for the most part, the court is less available for a short-term, quick remedy than a lot of plaintiffs hoped early on in the administration. The combined effect of that is real executive aggrandizement. It's not necessarily executive aggrandizement that is codified in new constitutional law outside the Appointments Clause context. Again, I don't know which way the courts are going to come out on a lot of this. I suspect the courts aren't going to hear a lot of it because it can be rendered moot. It can be hit a sort of issue where there's nobody withstanding. The Supreme Court doesn't like to get into constitutional issues and will usually try and avoid them, particularly where it intrudes potentially on the executive branch. But you end up with something like a de facto versus de jure separation of powers, where you say de jure, yeah, Congress gets to define how money is spent. But de facto, at least the way we're doing business, the executive branch can do a lot to throw wrenches in the gears and obstruct things and stop things, and particularly where their goal is to not do things that Congress wants government to do. It is a lot easier for the executive branch to just hold doing that. Exactly where the pushback on that under existing law is really limited. Maybe you could grow norms back. I think that was more or less the Biden administration's strategy outside of the Electoral Count Reform Act, really the only reform legislation meaningfully was enacted during the Biden administration. I think they thought the Trump administration was a passing anomaly, the first Trump administration, that they were very much conventional, institutional government people. They saw some allies in the Republican Party that feel the same way, including people who backed the CRA, and they hoped that if they were engaging in government in a more conventional fashion, that the norms would bounce back. And you look at what Merrick Garland approach in the Justice Department, very much centered on that idea. We're going to establish strong institutional norms for managing these agencies. Those have not withstood the fight this time, to say the least. And if anything, are probably far weaker than they were after the first Trump administration. That means legislative action. And mainly it means legislative action of a kind we haven't really thought about in like a century or two. Because what do you do conventionally with the law when Congress wants to legislate something? It becomes the executive branch's responsibility to enforce it. So what do you do when you have an executive branch who's unwilling to enforce the law as Congress intended for it to be enforced? We'll take every opportunity to nitpick and find ambiguities in the statute to interpret it more the way they want to. Maybe Congress can write a law specific and concrete enough to avoid that with help from the courts, and I think you will see stuff in that efforts in that direction, but it's going to be hard. I mean, in the end, I think you need to start looking for different enforcement mechanisms. And frankly, a lot of these are tools like key TAM actions, something we only use in the False Claims Act context now, but were much more prevalent early in the Republic, or broad causes of action, private causes of action, suing for damages or suing for remedies, are things that really the government and the law in the United States has moved strongly away from over the last century, and I think we may have to move back in that direction.
Molly, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, and I think one sort of additional challenge is that we are also in a moment where, in addition to sort of an expansion of executive power, a diminishment of congressional power, we have had an expansion of judicial power. And so how do you thread this needle between wanting a stronger legislative branch, but not trying to design a world where a stronger legislative branch is working through the judicial branch? Because we know from things like the decision in Loper Bright that the judicial branch is really interested in bolstering its own power, in addition to, in some cases, enabling an expanded executive power. So, like, getting this balance back to where it should be is not just a question of legislative power versus executive power. It's also thinking about the interests of the federal courts themselves and their own kind of power concerns in this system.
I don't disagree with that at all, but I will say I think it's a much more mixed picture on a lot of those fronts. We haven't looked at a lot of these tools, and there's reasons to think even our current Supreme Court, even the current judiciary, there may be space for some of these. Key TAM actions, again, something really hard to reconcile with the conventional conceptions of standing, but Justice Scalia himself, the kind of founder of modern standing constraints, basically said, yeah, key tame actions actually, at least in False Claims Act context, we have to buy that they're constitutionally legitimate because they were so prevalent early in the Republic, right? There's a lot of these gray areas to say, okay, we don't know where the court's going to come out on this. That's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. Because I don't think the executive aggrandizement is entirely, the judicial self-aggrandizement is entirely one way. It's more complicated, and particularly where Congress is very specific in giving rights of action to new parties, third parties. That's an area where the court has strongly suggested actually it has a lot of obligation to follow through on, including certain figures like Clarence Thomas. So it's a mixed picture.
I want to go to the
Please.
audience, because I do think, I'm glad you raised that, because I think that wherever you might land in your debate, we don't think of the court enough in terms of its own efforts to aggrandize its power. And that's been part of us since Marbury versus Madison, and that the court is a power player in this too. So I thank you for putting that on the table. Let's, we've got 2 mics or one? 2. Why don't we, if you can stay in the aisle, I'd like to take that lady over there. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. And this gentleman in the front. Why don't you both come in and we can have people in the panel answer? Please.
Thank you very much.
Identify who you are, where you're, what
Sure. My name is Dara, and I'm CEO of a large national nonprofit called Credit Builders Alliance. We have members that are nonprofits. It's quite large, 650 all over the country. So we surveyed them recently, and 40% had lost federal funding, either frozen or canceled. Some of them have sued. Those that have won, the portal opened and they submitted for reimbursement, and then the agency rejected the reimbursement. And then others are waiting for payments, like from HUD and from, you name it, SBA, that were supposed to come in February and so forth. So my question is now that we're in a new fiscal year, like, is it too late? Is it over? Is all that money gone? Because about 1/3 of them have laid off people, and it's really just disastrous. This includes a lot of CDFIs to get money. Thankfully, the whole CDFI fund that was supposed to be fired is now not supposed to be
CDFI,
fired.
for those who don't.
Community Development Financial
Thank
Institutions,
you.
certified by Treasury. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Sir?
Yeah, Bob Wyman. I think all presidents change policy. They sort of change what the government does. But the thing that's weird about Trump is that he's changing the government itself. He's changing the system. It feels like a revolution, not just a new administration. Many things that, I was taught when I was a kid, this is the way the U.S. government worked. Today, they don't really hold anymore. The thing that really concerns me is that after a revolution, one can assume, oh, maybe there'll be a counter-revolution. But in this case, we've had so much of this for so long, since 2017, it almost feels to me like the people are beginning to become accustomed to this new post-revolutionary government, the government that Trump is wanting. How can we essentially have a counter-revolution if, in fact, the people seem so willing to accept the results of the revolution we're going through?
Thank you. Think about that. I just want to make one quick point on your question, which is it's not clear that they are. The Economist on its poll tracker just yesterday notes that Trump has had the most rapid decline in approval of anybody in a long time. I think I'm quoting that correctly. So, and the first elections we've had suggest that it's not by any means clear that the people are accepting this, although we are getting used to a lot of things, which I think is important. But why don't you take those two, whoever wants to take that specific question, which goes to a lot of people out there. Your experience is not, how does that work? Yeah.
I can try and address the very technicality of this argument. Now, there's very technical aspects of the statute, the exact remedies, so I can't speak to the specifics of the case. This exact question, though, is something that's currently poised before what is the lead, I would think of as the lead kind of funding case. It's the AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition case that's been winding its way up through the D.C. Circuit, went to Supreme Court, now is back in the D.C. Circuit. And a fundamental issue there they were wrestling with was, okay, well, we had a preliminary injunction saying the government has to pay out money to us by the end of the fiscal year. And the government went to Supreme Court and said, hey, we want you to get rid of this preliminary injunction. We don't have to pay this out, at least for that fund of money that had been subject to a pocket rescission that had been. They sent a message to Congress, a special message that Molly mentioned earlier, and said, "Hey, rescind this," and that was under consideration as of the time at the end of the fiscal year. The Supreme Court basically said, "Okay, we're going to let the government hold on to this money. They don't have to pay it out because as long as this pocket rescission is in place," and that pocket rescission is now passed without this Congress acting on it. The implicit question there is like, well, what is the remedy? The exact question you're asking. In the litigation leading up to that and commentary around it, people point out the DC Circuit, there's at least two avenues where they've suggested that there may be statutory or even kind of a common law equity remedies after the expiration of the fiscal year, that people who are entitled to money they didn't receive could still be able to pursue those. But neither one was clear enough in the law that the district court was willing to rely on it as a basis for not providing the preliminary injunction. Long and short of it is that's something that you should look really closely at that litigation, the DC Circuit.
Can I ask you a question on this? And I want to ask, maybe Molly, you can take this up, because it seems to me the frustrating thing for people in the situation the lady described, and there are a lot of people like that out there, is the harm to the government, which the Supreme Court has particularly emphasized. The government is going to exist tomorrow morning. Many of these places go out of business while this litigation goes on, and there's no real remedy if you've gone under and all your people have taken new jobs. What good is the remedy?
And what I was going to say is Scott gave you a really great answer about the trees. I want to give you a little bit of an answer about the forest, which is that one of the real, to me, challenges and problems here is that because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations and entities around the country in exactly the same shoes as the organizations that you represent. But if we focus only on the question of, well, how do they get their specific money, we lose the fact that if the government is in the future allowed to sort of slow walk money in the way that it has this year, that again just disrupts the equilibrium of Congress making choices and then the executive branch executing them. And it sort of, I think, flips the incentives that even if Congress does something, even if Congress says like CFDI should get this amount of money, if the executive branch is legally allowed to just slow walk that, how long it takes that money to go out, that again represents a really significant increase in executive power. And I think sometimes we want to keep that part of the picture in mind as we're also talking about do these particular plaintiffs have a claim in this particular court to this particular money on this particular time frame.
Thank you, that's helpful. And anything else on that or on the normalization question of this period? Yeah.
I'll take your question. So I would offer just two observations. And first, that this issue of executive power and not my favorite word because I never say it, but the accruing of executive power long precedes Trump in 2017. And I think there's a long-standing undercurrent here of Congress and lawmakers willing to delegate that authority to the president, right? World War II, economic crisis, war crisis, like unwillingness to have their own fingerprints on these policies, for good or for not. And that, except for a brief shining moment in the 70s, it's really hard to claw back that power, right? For those listening to the tariff case with Gorsuch saying it's a one-way ratchet, and that's hard to take back. In the more narrow question, not narrow unimportant, but narrow contemporary question, like what happens with the next president, Republican or Democrat? Like, can you rebuild these bureaucracies? Can you rebuild the flight of expertise? Can you rebuild money for biomedical research? I think that's the big unknown. I think we have lots of colleagues who study comparative politics and say it's over. Maybe I'm naive here, but I haven't given up on the possibility that when Trump eventually leaves the system, depending on who follows him, that some of those incentives are back in Congress. Certainly, perhaps if Republicans are in the minority and where you stand depends on where you sit, suddenly they want to invest in those university research and so forth. Now, I could be totally wrong, but I think it's just premature to know the answer to the very decent and pressing right question.
No, I think it's really useful that you brought up the 70s, because when you think about aggrandizing executive power, you can take it back to TR or Wilson or certainly FDR. And it was a long period of aggrandizement. And the Nixon administration led to what people saw as a crisis. And it was the one time in our lifetimes, really, where Congress took back a bunch of power and managed through legislation, the War Powers Act, and budget laws to grab back power. And it's very interesting to think, will this period be followed by another period like that or not?
Except thinking large, big bipartisan Democratic majorities and very, very big political center, right, in that period versus today's intense partisanship. Like, how do you crack that divide? It's hard.
And a sense of what we might call kind of institutional patriotism among members of Congress that is woefully missing, I think, in many cases from our current Congress.
I love that term, by the way, institutional patriotism. One more round, a couple of people. The gentleman here on the right and the gentleman on the left here. I'm sorry if I left you out. And then I'll let everybody, and then you can use these questions to be responsive or to say whatever you want in closing. But sir.
I'm Albert Price. I'm a professor emeritus at University of Michigan Flint. I loved your reference to E. Schatzsnyder's Semi-Sovereign People, one of the great books. I also am thinking about Ted Lowy's interest group liberalism concept. And in terms of Congress giving up its authority, is the Republican leadership in Congress, has that broken down entirely? Don't they have relationships with the committees and subcommittees and interest groups so that when these programs are cut through the budget process, that's their constituents? And my understanding was that congressmen got on committees to benefit their constituents, and the interest group triangle was functional. Is that completely abrogated now?
This is a great, hang on to that. This is such a good Brookings question. And Molly's a Michigan PhD, so just by the way.
Go blue.
Go blue.
Hi, David Barker, professor at American University and a new non-resident fellow here. Going back to the question over here, I wanted to follow up on that. It seems to me that voters are not just growing more tolerant of executive aggrandizement, but they're expecting it. And it seems to me that what happens next may come down to Democratic, big D, Democratic voters in the next presidential cycle, and whether Democratic voters would even put up with presidential candidates who are not willing to basically take the next step and keep it going. I see the behavior by people like Gavin Newsom in California, who are just like jumping over themselves to be as Trumpy as they can be, mainly because that's what their voters want. And you see voters increasingly, getting upset when the Democrats aren't quote unquote strong enough, right? And so I'm just wondering what your guesses are or takes are as to what voters are going to be willing to put up with, Democratic voters are going to be willing to put up in the next couple of cycles, which may determine our future.
And Miriam, the gentleman right behind you was so nice when I skipped over him. Can you very briefly ask your question? I appreciate
Sure. My name is Isaiah, and I'm a first year at GW. My question is sort of, what do you guys think is the next frontier in terms of making the nominations process more partisan?
More partisan?
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's sort of become from this like individualized 60 vote threshold, or for example, getting voice votes on certain positions, to this like sort of like en bloc 50 vote threshold system. And I was wondering what's like the next stage of that process.
That's great. Why don't you take that right off, Katie, and then we'll go through the panel to take these two excellent questions over here. Go ahead.
So I guess your question is sort of, what will the Senate do to expedite the process even more?
Yes.
I think they'd have to do something that would limit how long committees have to consider nominees and how much time they can spend vetting individual nominees. But I think also, and my colleagues who study the House and the Senate can help me a lot on this, but it strikes me that committees are independent beings that have a lot of strength and a lot of power, and they're not going to give that up. This notion that they could be micromanaged and sort of said you have a limit here. I actually think one of the easier reforms that the Senate could take on is to reduce the number of positions that require Senate confirmation. They steadily have grown over the years as we create a Department of Homeland Security, as we create COOs and CFOs within the various agencies and departments. And so there's more and more jobs that require it, but do they really need it? It's not clear to me that there seems to be a tier, and the Partnership for Public Service has studied this pretty closely, to identify positions that would be ripe for not requiring Senate confirmation. And so by reducing the workload, you thereby would ultimately expedite the process itself. I actually think that's probably the most doable. They did reduce the number of positions, I believe, in 2013, but then over time they've built back so many, it was like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and they're sort of where they are again. But that seems to be the easiest, least controversial means of of expediting the process.
Thank you for that. Bill Galston, our colleague, and I did a work on this a long time ago, but this process has always been a mess. And that is the obvious solution, because and it's sort of, in theory, it's Congress trying to exercise power, but I'm not sure that's the best way to aggrandize their own power, and that there were just too many jobs
Right.
to
The
deal
amount
with.
of time that they spend on nominations is disproportionate to the amount of time they spend on legislating.
Yeah.
So.
Amen. So either of these questions, does the Michigan person want to take the Michigan question?
Which is just to say that I don't think that sort of iron triangle relationship is gone entirely, but I think that one of the consequences of a move by Congress to doing fewer higher profile things is it sort of reshapes some of those dynamics. So I think, for instance, about the One Big Beautiful Bill, the sort of decision by Republicans to do just one really large bill that had everything meant that was the hill on which everyone was going to live and die for what they wanted. And I think that reshaped some interest group strategies in some interesting ways. Thinking, for example, about like pharmaceutical companies and what they have and have not been active on vis-a-vis the HHS secretary, that sort of thing. So I don't think it's gone entirely, but I do think it's a place where there's some interesting change happening.
Sarah.
Well, unless you think my brain's not working up here, EJ just said aggrandizement like 3 times, and I can totally say that. I guess to David's question, I think you'd like put your finger on like the contemporary problem with electoral politics and nomination politics, right? What does it take to get the nomination, especially on the Democratic side, versus who can win the general election? And maybe there's less of a distinction than there was in the past, but it does raise the question, I think, like the AOC, the Bernie, versus, and the Gavin Newsom of California. I can't imagine swing voters elsewhere being attracted to that. So again, I think that's like the key question to ask, but whether or not there's a solution here where you find some general electability versus who can win the nomination.
Scott.
Yeah, I'll just take a quick bite at the aggrandizement question, a democracy question. It's a fair question to say, what are voters acclimate around? My instinct, I am not a vote follower like some of my colleagues are, so this is more from an instinctual, anecdotal perspective. My sense is that voters don't really vote around big things like the separation of powers or executive aggrandizement. That's just not the way they think about the world, the way lawyers do, the way political scientists do, certain people who really follow this stuff. What they're looking for is results. And that is the appeal of executive aggrandizement, particularly when you have a Congress that is riven by partisan inefficiencies, institutional efficiencies, reasons they haven't been able to deliver, some by design, but also somewhat aggrandized by the current moment. The biggest danger to executive aggrandizement, though, is executive aggrandizement that doesn't deliver. And I think that's what you're getting. Right? I don't think the Trump administration's record has been great so far in delivering everything that they want. And a lot of things that they are going to seem poised to deliver may be things that really not many people want outside of a kind of narrow ideological coalition. Right? I think we're seeing that in immigration. We're seeing that I think we're about to see it in how they've approached a lot of agencies that have been dismantled, undermined in ways that we're really going to feel the ramifications of another year or two. A lot of them, I'm an executive branch lawyer, that's my background. A lot of my colleagues, including colleagues who are really concerned with what the Trump administration is doing substantively, their concern is actually the backlash that comes afterwards. Is that not that we're going to see this constant trajectory of presidential power, but that the backlash to the current overreach is going to be so dramatic, it could weaken it in ways that cause other problems, bigger problems. I don't necessarily agree with that, for the record. Not all executive branch lawyers do. But I don't think it is just a one-way ratchet in that regard. It builds and builds and builds, and then if you don't keep the political coalition by actually delivering what you promise, then you can see real backswing the other way. That's actually really important to happen in some ways, but it's, I don't think it comes down to the socializing the populace. It's much more of a kind of a elite game of the people building these institutions, and that's a more complicated picture.
So I want to thank all our panel. I was grateful, Sarah, that you put Schatzschneider on the table. There are 2 great Schatzschneider quotes. One, well, there are many great Schatzschneider quotes, actually, but two that seem relevant is, one is the bystanders are part of the calculus of all conflicts. So people who are bystanders, no one in this room for sure, have to think about what their role is. But Schatzschneider also said, democracy is a system for the resolution of conflict, not for vengeance. And I appreciate my colleagues because they care about government as constructive and as resolving conflict. And I'm sure this audience does too. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.